What happens when an unbreakable tyrant meets a fearless rebel? In the heart of a frozen kingdom, a king ruled by iron and a woman who refuses to bow are about to collide in a way neither of them expected. Betrayal, passion, and a forbidden love that could change everything. But at what cost? Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what do you love most about these historical romance stories? Let's dive into a tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The harsh winter winds howled through the narrow streets of Poenari, a small village nestled in the heart of 19th century Romania. Snow blanketed the dilapidated houses, their wooden frames groaning under the weight of both ice and despair. Inside these humble dwellings, families huddled together for warmth, their faces gaunt with hunger and worry. King Vladislav Dragomir's latest decree had pushed the villagers to the brink of starvation. The royal tax collectors, like vultures circling dying prey, extracted every last coin from the already impoverished people. Children cried from empty bellies, while parents exchanged defeated glances, wondering how they would survive until spring. But in one modest home on the outskirts of Poenari, a flame of defiance burned brightly. Ilinca Petrescu, a woman of 35 with fiery green eyes and long chestnut hair, paced back and forth in her small kitchen. Her calloused hands, evidence of years of hard work, were clenched into fists at her sides. "We cannot stand for this any longer," she declared to the small group of villagers gathered in her home. "King Vladislav may sit on his golden throne, but he forgets that a kingdom is nothing without its people." Mihai, the village blacksmith, nodded in agreement. "But what can we do, Ilinca? The king's men are everywhere. One wrong word and we'll find ourselves in the dungeons, or worse." Ilinca's eyes flashed with determination. "We start small. We organize. We show the people that they are not alone in their suffering. United, our voices will be too loud for even the stone walls of Castle Bran to silence." As the group discussed their plans in hushed tones, none of them noticed the shadow that passed by the frosted window. Outside, a hooded figure hurried through the snow-covered streets, eager to report what they had overheard to the king's men. Miles away, in the opulent halls of Castle Bran, King Vladislav Dragomir sat upon his throne, a study in cold magnificence. At 45, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. His black hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was neatly combed back, accentuating the sharp angles of his face. The king's features were set in a perpetual frown as he listened to the latest reports from his advisors. The kingdom's coffers were overflowing, yet he felt no satisfaction. Since the death of his beloved wife a decade ago, Vladislav had ruled with an iron fist, believing that only through absolute control could he protect himself from further loss. A commotion at the entrance to the throne room drew his attention. Captain Dragos, head of the royal guard, strode in, his face flushed with excitement. "Your Majesty," he announced, bowing low, "we have received word of a rebellion brewing in the village of Poenari. A woman named Ilinca Petrescu is rallying the people against your rule." Vladislav's eyes narrowed dangerously. "A woman, you say? And what makes this Ilinca think she can challenge my authority?" Captain Dragos swallowed hard. "She speaks of unity, sire, of the people's power when they stand together. Our informant says she has a way with words that ignites hope in even the most downtrodden." For a moment something flickered in the king's cold eyes, a spark of curiosity, perhaps even admiration. But it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a familiar steely resolve. "Bring her to me," Vladislav commanded, his voice as sharp as a blade. "I want to see this rebel who dares to stir discontent in my kingdom." As the captain hurried to carry out his orders, the king sat back on his throne, a strange mixture of anger and intrigue coursing through his veins. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something. Anticipation? Challenge? He couldn't quite name it, but it unsettled him. Back in Poenari, Ilinca had just bid farewell to the last of her co-conspirators when the night exploded into chaos. The door to her humble home burst open, wood splintering as armored soldiers poured in. Ilinca barely had time to register what was happening before rough hands seized her arms. Ilinca Petrescu, a gruff voice announced. By order of King Vladislav Dragomir, you are under arrest for treason against the crown. Ilinca's heart raced, but she held her head high, green eyes blazing with defiance. As they dragged her out into the biting cold, she caught sight of her neighbors peering fearfully from behind curtains. In that moment, she made a silent vow. She would not break no matter what awaited her at Castle Bran. The journey to the castle was a blur of numbing cold and growing dread. Yet with each mile that passed, Ilinca's resolve only strengthened. She had known the risks when she chose to speak out against the king's tyranny. Now, facing the consequences, she found an inner well of courage she hadn't known existed. As the imposing silhouette of Castle Bran loomed before her, Ilinca took a deep breath. She was about to come face to face with the man responsible for so much suffering. The man she had grown to hate with every fiber of her being. Little did she know that this encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom and her own heart. Inside the castle, King Vladislav paced in his private chambers, an unfamiliar tension coiling in his chest. He paused before a gilded mirror, studying his reflection. The face that stared back at him was one he barely recognized, hard lines etched by years of bitter rule, eyes devoid of warmth. For a fleeting moment, he wondered what his late wife would think of the man he had become, but he pushed the thought away, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. This rebel, this Ilinca Petrescu, would soon learn the price of defying her king. As the heavy doors to the throne room creaked open, Vladislav turned, his gaze locking onto the woman being half dragged, half marched before him. What he saw made him catch his breath. Ilinca stood proudly, despite the chains binding her wrists. Her green eyes burned with a fire that seemed to challenge the very air around her. For the first time in years, King Vladislav Dragomir felt a spark of something long forgotten, intrigue, and perhaps a grudging admiration. The game was about to begin, and neither the Tyrant King nor the rebel Maiden could have predicted the tumultuous journey that lay ahead. The first rays of dawn crept through the narrow window of Ilinca's cell, casting long shadows across the damp stone floor. She had spent a restless night, her mind racing with thoughts of her village, her cause, and the enigmatic tyrant who now held her fate in his hands. Despite the chill that seeped into her bones, Ilinca's spirit remained unbroken. The sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor snapped her to attention. Keys rattled, and the cell door swung open with a foreboding creak. 2 guards entered, their faces impassive. "On your feet!" one of them barked. "The king demands your presence." Ilinca rose slowly, her chains clinking with each movement. "How kind of His Majesty to extend an invitation," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I do hope I'm dressed appropriately for the occasion." The guard's eye twitched, but he said nothing as they led her through the winding passages of Castle Bran. Ilinca took in her surroundings, noting potential escape routes even as she marveled at the opulence around her. Tapestries depicting great battles and royal lineages adorned the walls, a stark contrast to the poverty she knew existed just beyond the castle gates. As they approached the throne room, Ilinca steeled herself. She had dreamed of confronting King Vladislav for years, imagining all the things she would say to the man responsible for so much suffering. Now that the moment had arrived, she was determined not to waste it. The massive doors swung open, revealing a cavernous hall dominated by a single imposing throne. And there, watching her with eyes of steel, sat King Vladislav Dragomir. Ilinca was struck by how different he looked up close. The stories painted him as a monster, but the man before her was undeniably human, and, she grudgingly admitted, possessed of a certain magnetism. His strong features were set in a mask of cold authority, but there was something in his gaze that gave her pause. Curiosity, perhaps? Or was it merely the calculation of a predator sizing up its prey? "So," Vladislav's deep voice resonated through the chamber, "this is the woman who dares to incite rebellion in my kingdom." Ilinca lifted her chin defiantly. "And you must be the man who dares to call himself king while his people starve." A collective gasp echoed from the assembled courtiers. Vladislav's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication that her words had any effect on him. "You have a sharp tongue, Ilinca Petrescu," he said, leaning forward on his throne. "I wonder if you have the wit to match it. Tell me, what do you hope to achieve with your little uprising?" Ilinca met his gaze unflinchingly. "Justice, Your Majesty. A chance for the people of Panari, and all your subjects, to live with dignity. To not have to choose between paying your taxes and feeding their children." Vladislav's eyes narrowed. "And you believe you know better than your king how to govern a realm? How presumptuous." "I know the suffering of those you claim to rule," Ilinca shot back. "When was the last time you walked among your people, Your Majesty? Have you seen the hollow cheeks of the children or heard the cries of mothers with no milk to give their babes?" For a moment something flashed in Vladislav's eyes. A fleeting glimpse of emotion quickly buried beneath his icy exterior. He rose from his throne, descending the steps until he stood directly before Ilinca. "You speak of things you do not understand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The burden of the crown is not for common folk to comprehend. I do what must be done to keep this kingdom strong." Ilinca didn't back down, even as she felt the heat of his presence so close to her. "A kingdom is only as strong as its people, Your Majesty, and right now, your people are breaking." For a long moment they stood locked in a battle of wills, neither willing to look away first. The tension in the room was palpable, courtiers holding their breath as they waited to see how their king would respond to such unprecedented defiance. Finally, Vladislav spoke, his tone deceptively calm. "You've certainly given me much to consider, Ilinca Petrescu. Perhaps we should continue this enlightening conversation in more private surroundings." He turned to Captain Dragos. "Have the prisoner escorted to my personal study. I believe a more thorough interrogation is in order." As the guards moved to comply, Ilinca felt a flicker of uncertainty. She had expected immediate punishment for her boldness, not whatever this was. The look in Vladislav's eyes as he watched her being led away was unreadable, but it sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. An hour later, Ilinca found herself in a richly appointed study, the chains on her wrists a stark contrast to the leather-bound books and polished wood surrounding her. King Vladislav stood by a large window, his back to her, as he gazed out over the snow-covered landscape. "Do you know why I brought you here, Ilinca?" he asked without turning. She straightened her shoulders. "To try and intimidate me into submission, I assume. I warn you, Your Majesty, it won't work." Vladislav chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "No, I don't imagine it would. You've proven to be remarkably resilient." He turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, what would you do if you were in my position? How would you govern a kingdom constantly threatened by enemies both within and without?" Ilinca blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. I would start by listening to the people, by understanding their needs and fears. And if those needs conflicted with the greater good of the realm," Vladislav pressed. "If showing compassion meant leaving us vulnerable to invasion or economic collapse." "There must be a balance," Ilinca insisted. "Strength doesn't have to come at the cost of humanity." Vladislav's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "An idealistic view. But tell me, Ilinca, have you ever had to make a decision that would haunt you for the rest of your days? Have you ever sacrificed something precious for a greater purpose?" For the first time, Ilinca hesitated. There was something in his voice, a hint of old pain that made her wonder what lay beneath the tyrant's facade. I can't say that I have, Your Majesty, but I know that the people of Poinari, of all your kingdom, are making such sacrifices every day just to survive." Vladislav nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I have lost touch with the realities of life beyond these walls." He moved closer, studying her face intently. "You intrigue me, Ilinca Petrescu. Your passion, your conviction, they remind me of someone I once knew, someone I lost long ago." Ilinca's heart raced at his proximity. She could see the flecks of silver in his steel-gray eyes, could smell the subtle scent of pine and leather that clung to him. "Your wife?" she asked softly, remembering the whispered stories of the queen's untimely death. A shadow passed over Vladislav's face. Yes, she had a heart for the people, much like you seem to. Her loss changed everything. For a moment, the mask of the tyrant slipped, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath, a man carrying a burden of grief and loneliness. Ilinca felt a surprising twinge of empathy, quickly followed by confusion. This was not how she had imagined her confrontation with the king would go. "Your Majesty, she began, but Vladislav cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Enough. I've made a decision." His voice regained its authoritative edge. "You will remain here in the castle, under my direct supervision. If you truly wish to advocate for your people, you'll have the opportunity to do so, as my personal advisor on matters of the common folk." Ilinca's jaw dropped. "What? But I'm your prisoner, a traitor in your eyes." Vladislav's lips curved in a predatory smile. "Consider it an act of royal magnanimity. Unless, of course, you'd prefer the dungeons." Ilinca's mind raced. This was unexpected, potentially dangerous, and yet it could be an opportunity to effect real change, to help her people from within the very seat of power. I accept your offer, Your Majesty," she said cautiously. "Though I warn you, I won't be silent about injustices I see, even if they come from the throne itself." Vladislav's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. "I would expect nothing less, my fierce rebel. This promises to be a most interesting arrangement." As he called for guards to escort Ilinca to her new quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just entered into a game far more complex and perilous than she had ever imagined. The air between them crackled with an energy she couldn't quite name, a mixture of antagonism, curiosity, and something else entirely. One thing was certain: life in Castle Bran would never be the same again. The days that followed Ilinca's unexpected appointment as the king's advisor were a whirlwind of activity. She found herself thrust into a world of political intrigue and courtly machinations, all while trying to navigate the treacherous waters of Castle Bran. The opulence of her new quarters, a spacious chamber with richly embroidered tapestries and a view of the snow-capped mountains, did little to ease her discomfort. One crisp morning, as Ilinca stood by the window, lost in thoughts of her village and the people she'd left behind, a sharp knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Enter," she called, turning to face whoever sought her attention. To her surprise, it was King Vladislav himself who strode into the room, his presence immediately filling the space. Ilinca felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of apprehension and something else she couldn't quite name coursing through her. "Your Majesty," she said, dipping into a small curtsy that was more mockery than deference, "to what do I owe the pleasure of your company so early in the day?" Vladislav's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. "I've come to put you to the test, my lady advisor. There's to be a gathering of nobles this evening. A tedious affair, but necessary for maintaining alliances. You will attend." Ilinca's eyebrows shot up. "Attend? As what exactly? Your trophy rebel?" "As my advisor, of course," Vladislav replied smoothly. "I'm curious to see how you handle yourself among the wolves of the court. Consider it your first real challenge in this new role of yours." Ilinca crossed her arms, studying the king's face. There was something in his eyes, a glimmer of challenge, perhaps even anticipation. "And what exactly do you expect me to do at this gathering, Your Majesty?" Vladislav moved closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Observe. Listen. Show me that your passion for the people extends beyond fiery speeches and ill-conceived rebellions. Prove to me that you have the wit and diplomacy to effect real change." Their eyes locked, and Ilinca felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. "Very well," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "I accept your challenge. But don't expect me to play the meek and obedient servant. If I'm to be your advisor, I'll speak my mind. Consequences be damned." A slow smile spread across Vladislav's face, transforming his usually stern features. "I would expect nothing less, my fierce Ilinca. In fact, I'm counting on it." As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Oh, and do try to dress the part." I've had suitable attire sent to your chambers. We can't have you looking like a peasant among peacocks now, can we?" With that parting shot, he was gone, leaving Ilinca to wonder what game the king was really playing, and whether she was prepared for the stakes involved. That evening, as Ilinca made her way to the grand ballroom, she felt acutely aware of every eye upon her. The gown Vladislav had provided was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk and silver embroidery, far more luxurious than anything she'd ever worn. Yet she walked with her head held high, determined not to let the trappings of wealth intimidate her. As she entered the ballroom, a hush fell over the assembled nobles. Whispers erupted in her wake, some curious, others decidedly hostile. Ilinca caught fragments of conversation as she moved through the crowd. "Isn't that the rebel from Poenari? What is she doing here? The king must have lost his mind." Steeling herself, Ilinca approached a group of noblewomen who were eyeing her with barely concealed disdain. "Good evening, ladies," she said, her voice steady. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure of being introduced. I'm Ilinca Petrescu, advisor to His Majesty on matters of the common folk." One of the women, a haughty blonde with a string of pearls that could have fed Ilinca's village for a month, sneered. "Oh, we know who you are. The question is, what do you think you're doing here? This isn't some village tavern, you know." Ilinca smiled, sweet as poison. "You're absolutely right, my lady. If it were a village tavern, the conversation would be far more intelligent and the company far more genuine." The woman's face flushed an ugly red, but before she could retort, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Ladies, I see you've met my newest advisor." King Vladislav appeared at Ilinca's side, his hand coming to rest lightly on the small of her back. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through her body. "I trust you're making her feel welcome?" The noblewomen fell over themselves to simper and agree, their earlier hostility masked by false smiles. Ilinca fought the urge to roll her eyes. As the king led her away, she murmured, "I don't need you to fight my battles for me, your majesty." Vladislav chuckled low in his throat. "Oh, I'm well aware of that. But I couldn't resist seeing the look on Lady Eleonora's face when I referred to you as my advisor. I do believe she nearly swallowed her pearls." Despite herself, Ilinca felt a smile tugging at her lips. There was something almost boyish in the king's amusement, a far cry from his usual icy demeanor. As the evening wore on, Ilinca found herself engaged in conversation after conversation. Some nobles were genuinely curious about her role and her views, while others seemed intent on tripping her up. Through it all, she could feel Vladislav's gaze following her, assessing her performance in this unfamiliar arena. It was nearing midnight when Ilinca found a moment of respite on a secluded balcony. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the stuffy ballroom. She leaned against the stone railing, looking out over the moonlit landscape, when she sensed a presence behind her. "Well, my fierce rebel," Vladislav's voice was low and intimate in the darkness, "how are you finding your first foray into courtly politics?" Ilinca turned to face him, acutely aware of how close he stood. "Exhausting," she admitted. "How do you stomach all the false flattery and hidden daggers?" Vladislav's lips quirked in a wry smile. "Years of practice. But you've surprised me tonight, Ilinca. You've held your own admirably." "High praise indeed coming from the Tyrant King," she said, but there was no real venom in her words. For a long moment they stood in silence, the air between them charged with an energy neither was willing to name. Finally Vladislav spoke, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "You remind me so much of her, you know. My Adelina. She had your fire, your unwavering conviction." Ilinca's breath caught in her throat. This was the first time the king had spoken of his late wife to her. What happened to her?" she asked gently. Pain flashed across Vladislav's face, quickly masked. "She died. A winter fever. I couldn't save her." In that moment, Ilinca saw past the tyrant to the man beneath, a man still haunted by loss. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Vladislav's eyes met hers, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Captain Dragos appeared at the balcony entrance, bowing low. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, but there's an urgent matter requiring your attention." The spell broken, Vladislav's face hardened back into its usual mask of authority. "Very well, I'll be there momentarily." As the captain retreated, Vladislav turned back to Ilinca. "It seems duty calls, but this evening has been illuminating. Perhaps there's hope for you yet, my lady advisor." With that he was gone, leaving Ilinca alone on the balcony with her swirling thoughts. She looked out once more at the moonlit landscape, her mind replaying every moment of her interactions with the king. What had started as a simple game of political maneuvering was quickly becoming something far more complex and dangerous. As she made her way back to her chambers, Ilinca couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice. The question was, would she have the courage to take the leap, and could she trust Vladislav to catch her if she fell? The days following the grand ball were a whirlwind of activity for Ilinca. She found herself thrust into the heart of castle politics, attending council meetings and poring over reports of the kingdom's affairs. Despite the initial hostility from some courtiers, she was slowly beginning to make her mark, her passionate advocacy for the common people impossible to ignore. One particularly chilly morning, as Ilinca made her way to the king's study for their daily briefing, she couldn't shake a sense of unease. The previous night, she had overheard whispered conversations among the servants, hushed tales of the king's past that painted a picture far more complex than she had imagined. Steeling herself, she knocked on the heavy oak door of Vladislav's private chambers. "Enter," came the familiar command from within. As Ilinca stepped inside, she found the king standing by the fireplace, his tall frame silhouetted against the dancing flames. He turned to face her, and she was struck by the weariness in his eyes. "Your Majesty," she began, dipping into a small curtsy, "I've brought the reports on the grain stores in the northern provinces as you requested." Vladislav nodded, gesturing for her to approach. "And what is your assessment, lady advisor? Will we have enough to see our people through the winter?" Ilinca hesitated, weighing her words carefully. "The situation is precarious, Your Majesty. If we continue to export at the current rate, I fear many will go hungry before spring arrives." The king's jaw tightened, a flash of something, anger, frustration, crossing his face. "And what would you have me do, Ilinca? Break treaties with our allies? Risk war for the sake of fuller bellies?" "I would have you remember your duty to your own people first," Ilinca replied, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. "A starving populace is just as dangerous as any foreign army." For a long moment, Vladislav said nothing, his steel-gray eyes locked on hers. Then, to her surprise, his shoulders sagged slightly. "You speak truth, as always. It's refreshing, if somewhat maddening." Emboldened by his unexpected vulnerability, Ilinca pressed on. "Your Majesty, there's something else I wish to discuss. I've been hearing stories about your past, about the Queen." Vladislav's posture stiffened immediately, his face hardening into an impenetrable mask. "Have you now? And pray tell, what business is my past to you?" Ilinca took a deep breath, knowing she was treading on dangerous ground. "I believe it's relevant to understanding the man who rules this kingdom, the man I'm meant to advise." For a heartbeat, she thought he might order her from the room. Instead, Vladislav moved to a nearby cabinet, withdrawing a crystal decanter of amber liquid. He poured 2 glasses, offering one to Ilinca. "Very well," he said, his voice low and tightly controlled. "You wish to know of my past? Then listen well, for I'll not speak of it again." Ilinca accepted the glass, the brandy burning a path down her throat as she took a small sip. Vladislav began to pace, his words coming slowly at first, then gaining momentum as if a dam had broken. "I was not always as you see me now," he began. "There was a time when I ruled with a lighter hand, when hope and love guided my actions as much as duty. Adelina, my queen, she was the heart of it all." His eyes took on a faraway look, lost in memory. "She came from a small village, not unlike your Poenari. A diplomatic marriage, arranged to quell unrest in the outer provinces. I expected duty, perhaps friendship in time. I did not expect her." Vladislav's voice softened, filled with a tenderness Ilinca had never heard before. Adelina was unlike anyone I had ever known. Fierce, intelligent, compassionate. She challenged me at every turn, pushed me to be a better man, a better king. And somehow, against all odds, we fell deeply in love. Ilinca found herself drawn into the story, her heart aching for the man before her, so different from the tyrant she had come to know. "What happened?" she asked gently. Vladislav's face darkened. "For years we ruled together in relative harmony. The kingdom prospered and we were happy. But there were always those who resented Adelina's influence, who saw her common birth as a weakness in the crown." He took a long drink from his glass, steeling himself for what came next. It was the winter of her 35th year. A fever swept through the castle. At first we thought little of it. Such things were not uncommon. But Adelina, she insisted on tending to the sick herself, against all advice. Ilinca's breath caught in her throat, already knowing where this tale would end. "She fell ill so quickly," Vladislav continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Within days she was gone, and with her, every shred of warmth and compassion I possessed." He turned to face Ilinca, his eyes blazing with a pain so raw it took her breath away. "Do you understand now, my fierce rebel? I built these walls around my heart, around this kingdom, because I learned the hard way that love is a weakness. Compassion is a luxury a king cannot afford." Ilinca set down her glass, taking a tentative step towards him. "But your majesty, surely you can see that closing yourself off has only caused more suffering. Your people need their king, not just his strength, but his humanity as well." Vladislav's laugh was bitter. "And what would you have me do? Return to the naive fool I once was, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to every vulture and jackal that circles our borders?" "No," Ilinca said firmly. "I would have you find a balance. Use the wisdom you've gained, but don't let it extinguish the man Adelina loved. The man who, I believe, still exists beneath all this armor you've built." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging heavy between them. Then, slowly, Vladislav reached out, his hand cupping Ilinca's cheek with unexpected gentleness. "You are a dangerous woman, Ilinca Petrescu," he murmured. "You make me want to believe in impossible things." Ilinca's heart raced at his touch, her body betraying her with a shiver of something that was definitely not fear. "Nothing is impossible, your majesty," she whispered. "Not if we have the courage to try." The air between them crackled with tension, 100 unspoken possibilities hanging in the balance. Just as Vladislav began to lean in, his eyes darkening with an emotion Ilinca dared not name, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. "Your Majesty," Captain Dragos's voice called urgently from the other side. "Forgive the interruption, but there's been an incident in the lower town. Your presence is required immediately." Vladislav stepped back, the wall slamming back into place behind his eyes. "Duty calls, it seems," he said, his voice once again the cool, controlled tone of a king. "We'll continue our discussion another time, Lady Advisor." As Ilinca watched him stride from the room, her mind reeling from all that had transpired, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. The game they played had taken on new stakes, and the consequences of losing might be more than either of them could bear. The weeks following Vladislav's revelation about his past were fraught with tension. Ilinca found herself hyper-aware of the king's presence, her heart racing every time their eyes met across a crowded room. For his part, Vladislav seemed to be waging an internal battle, vacillating between moments of unexpected warmth and retreating behind his icy facade. As winter tightened its grip on the kingdom, a fierce storm descended upon Castle Bran. Howling winds rattled the windows and snow piled high against the ancient stone walls. Ilinca stood at the window of her chambers, watching the blizzard rage outside, when a frantic knocking at her door startled her from her reverie. "My lady." It was Anna, one of the young servant girls. "Please, you must come quickly. There's been an accident in the East Wing." Ilinca's heart leapt into her throat. "What kind of accident? Is anyone hurt?" "It's the roof, my lady," Anna explained breathlessly. "A section has collapsed under the weight of the snow. Some of the servants are trapped, and His Majesty, he's gone to help." Without hesitation, Ilinca grabbed a thick cloak and followed Anna through the winding corridors of the castle. As they neared the east wing, the sound of shouting and the ominous creak of straining timber filled the air. The scene that greeted them was one of chaos. A gaping hole in the ceiling allowed snow and icy wind to whip through the hallway. Servants and guards scrambled to clear debris, while others worked to shore up the remaining structure. And there, in the midst of it all, was Vladislav. Gone was the aloof king, replaced by a man working shoulder to shoulder with his people, his fine clothes soaked and covered in dust. As Ilinca watched, transfixed, Vladislav helped pull a young maid from beneath a fallen beam. The girl clung to him, sobbing in relief, and the king's face softened with a gentleness Ilinca had rarely seen. "It's all right now," she heard him murmur. "You're safe." Their eyes met across the debris-strewn hallway, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Ilinca saw in Vladislav's gaze a vulnerability, a raw humanity that took her breath away. The spell was broken by a sickening crack from above. Ilinca looked up in horror to see another section of the ceiling beginning to give way, directly over where Vladislav stood. "Your Majesty!" she cried out, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She launched herself forward, colliding with Vladislav and sending them both tumbling to the ground, just as a shower of timber and stone crashed down where he had been standing. For a heartbeat, they lay tangled together, Ilinca's face pressed against Vladislav's chest, the sound of his racing heart drowning out the chaos around them. Then, strong arms encircled her, and she found herself being pulled to her feet and hustled away from the danger zone. "Are you mad?" Vladislav's voice was rough with emotion as he gripped her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for injury. "You could have been killed." Ilinca met his gaze defiantly, her own fear and adrenaline making her bold. "So could you. What were you thinking, putting yourself in harm's way like that?" "I was thinking of my people," he shot back. "Something you've been so adamant about reminding me to do." They glared at each other, chests heaving, the air between them charged with something far more potent than anger. Ilinca was acutely aware of Vladislav's hands still on her shoulders, of how close they stood. "Your Majesty," Captain Dragos interrupted, approaching with barely concealed concern. "We've cleared most of the debris, but the structure is still unstable. We need to evacuate this wing immediately." Vladislav nodded, his eyes never leaving Ilinca's face. "Very well. See to it that everyone is safely relocated. Lady Ilinca and I will make our way to the west wing." As they made their way through the twisting corridors, the sound of the storm grew louder. Ilinca realized with a start that they were heading towards one of the castle's towers, not the main hall where the other evacuees were gathered. "Where are we going?" she asked, confusion and a flicker of something else, anticipation, coursing through her. Vladislav's answer was cut short by another ominous rumble from above. Without warning, the floor beneath their feet began to tremble. "Run!" Vladislav shouted, grabbing Ilinca's hand and pulling her forward. They raced down the hallway as the ceiling behind them began to collapse, debris raining down in their wake. With a final burst of speed, they reached the tower door. Vladislav wrenched it open, practically throwing Ilinca inside before following and slamming it shut behind them. The sound of falling stone and timber echoed from the other side, and then silence, broken only by the howling of the wind outside and their labored breathing. Ilinca leaned against the cold stone wall, her heart pounding. "That was too close," she managed between gasps. Vladislav nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Indeed. It seems we're trapped here until the storm passes and they can clear a path to us." As the adrenaline began to fade, Ilinca became acutely aware of their situation. They were alone, in a small circular room with only a narrow bed, a desk, and a fireplace for furnishings. And Vladislav was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You saved my life," he said softly, taking a step towards her. Again. Ilinca swallowed hard, unable to look away from his piercing gaze. "You saved others. I just returned the favor." Another step, and he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Is that all it was, my fierce Ilinca? A simple transaction?" She began. But the words died on her lips as Vladislav reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've awakened something in me," he murmured, his voice low and husky. "Something I thought had died with Adelina. And it terrifies me." Ilinca's heart raced, every nerve in her body singing with awareness. "Why does it terrify you?" she whispered. Vladislav's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Because I've spent years building walls to protect myself, to protect this kingdom. And you make me want to tear them all down." Time seemed to stand still as they stood there, teetering on the edge of something monumental. Ilinca knew she should step back, should remember all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. But in that moment, with Vladislav looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life, she couldn't bring herself to care. "Then tear them down," she breathed. With a groan that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, Vladislav closed the distance between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that was at once gentle and fiercely passionate, as if he were pouring years of pent-up emotion into this one moment. Ilinca melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. All the tension, all the unspoken longing of the past weeks, crystallized into this single perfect instant. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, Vladislav rested his forehead against hers. "What have you done to me, Ilinca Petrescu?" he whispered, his voice filled with wonder and a touch of fear. Ilinca smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Nothing you haven't done to me, Your Majesty." He chuckled softly, the sound warming her from the inside out. "I think, given the circumstances, you might call me Vladislav." As they stood there wrapped in each other's arms while the storm raged outside, Ilinca knew that everything had changed. The game they had been playing was over, replaced by something far more real and infinitely more dangerous. But as Vladislav leaned in to capture her lips once more, she found she didn't care about the danger. For the first time in years, hope blossomed in her chest, hope for herself, for Vladislav, and for the kingdom they both longed to save. The path ahead would not be easy, but in that moment, locked away in a tower with the man she had once called her enemy, Ilinca felt invincible. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The days following the storm and their passionate encounter in the tower were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions for both Ilinca and Vladislav. They found themselves stealing glances across crowded rooms, their hands brushing, accidentally, as they pored over reports together. The air between them crackled with an electric tension that was impossible to ignore. Yet for every moment of warmth and connection, there were equal instances of doubt and hesitation. Vladislav, in particular, seemed to be waging an internal war between his growing feelings for Ilinca and his long-held belief that love was a weakness he could not afford. It was in this charged atmosphere that preparations began for the kingdom's annual midwinter ball. The grand event was a centuries-old tradition, bringing together nobles from across the realm to celebrate the turning of the year and reaffirm their allegiances to the crown. As Ilinca made her way to the king's study for their daily meeting, she couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Something in Vladislav's demeanor had shifted over the past few days, a coldness creeping back into his eyes that she had hoped was gone for good. She knocked on the heavy oak door, entering when she heard his muffled, "Come in." Vladislav stood by the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. "Lady Ilinca," he said, his voice formal and distant. "I trust you're well this morning?" Ilinca's heart sank at his tone. "I am, Your Majesty, though I admit to some confusion about the change in your address." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I've been doing a great deal of thinking, Ilinca, about our situation, about the future of this kingdom." She took a step closer, fighting the urge to reach out to him. "And what conclusions have you drawn?" Vladislav's jaw tightened. "That I have been allowing personal feelings to cloud my judgment. That I have a duty to this realm that must come before all else." Ilinca felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. "I see," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "And what does this mean for us?" for the progress we've been making in improving the lives of your people. It means, Vladislav said, his voice cold, that we must remember our proper roles. You are my advisor, nothing more. And I am a king who cannot afford the luxury of love. Anger flared in Ilinca's chest, cutting through her hurt. Is that what you truly believe? That what we share is a luxury? A weakness? It is a distraction, Vladislav snapped, one that our enemies would be all too eager to exploit. I cannot risk the safety of this kingdom for the sake of personal desires. Ilinca laughed bitterly. And here I thought you were finally beginning to see that compassion and love could be a source of strength, not weakness. Tell me, Your Majesty, what has brought about this sudden change of heart? Vladislav's eyes flashed with something, pain, regret, before hardening once more. Reality, Ilinca. The reality of the world we live in. A world where kings cannot afford to be guided by their hearts. Then perhaps, Ilinca said, her voice low and intense, you are not the king this realm needs. Perhaps you have forgotten the lessons your Adelina tried to teach you. At the mention of his late wife's name, Vladislav flinched as if struck. For a moment, his mask slipped, revealing the turmoil beneath. But just as quickly, it was gone. Enough, he said, his tone brooking no argument. We have work to do. The midwinter ball approaches, and there are matters of state to discuss. Ilinca wanted to scream, to shake him until he saw reason. Instead, she took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. Very well, Your Majesty. What would you like to discuss first? As they delved into the minutiae of diplomatic protocols and seating arrangements, Ilinca couldn't help but feel that something precious was slipping through her fingers. But she was nothing if not determined. If Vladislav thought he could simply shut her out, he was about to learn just how stubborn she could be. The night of the midwinter ball arrived, the castle a glittering wonderland of ice sculptures and twinkling lights. Ilinca stood before the mirror in her chambers, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her. The gown Vladislav had commissioned for her was a masterpiece of silver and midnight blue, clinging to her curves before flaring out in a sweep of shimmering fabric. As she made her way to the grand ballroom, Ilinca steeled herself for the evening ahead. She had a plan, one last attempt to break through the walls Vladislav had erected between them. The announcer's voice rang out as she entered. Lady Ilinca Petrescu, royal advisor to His Majesty, King Vladislav Dragomir. All eyes turned to her, a mix of curiosity and barely concealed hostility from some of the nobles who still saw her as an upstart commoner. But Ilinca held her head high, her gaze fixed on the far end of the room where Vladislav sat upon his throne. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Ilinca saw a flicker of something in his gaze. Longing, perhaps, quickly masked by cool indifference. She made her way through the crowd, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing servant. Your Majesty, she said, dipping into a curtsy before him. The ball is magnificent. You've outdone yourself this year. Vladislav nodded, his expression neutral. Indeed. I trust you're enjoying yourself, Lady Ilinca. Oh, immensely, she replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. Though I must admit I find myself missing the more stimulating conversations we used to share. A muscle ticked in Vladislav's jaw, but before he could respond, the orchestra struck up a lively waltz. Ilinca saw her opportunity and seized it. Would you honor me with a dance, Your Majesty? She asked, extending her hand. For the sake of diplomacy, of course. For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then, to the visible shock of the surrounding courtiers, Vladislav rose and took her hand. For diplomacy, he agreed, his voice low and tight. As he led her onto the dance floor, Ilinca could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them. But as soon as Vladislav's hand settled on her waist, the rest of the world faded away. They moved together with a grace that belied the tension between them, their bodies remembering a harmony their minds were trying to deny. Ilinca looked up into Vladislav's face, seeing the conflict raging behind his eyes. Why are you doing this? He murmured, his lips barely moving. Because someone needs to remind you of what's truly important, Ilinca replied. Because I refuse to believe that the man I've come to know, to care for, is nothing but a mask. Vladislav's hand tightened on her waist. Ilinca, please, you must understand. No, she cut him off, her voice fierce but quiet. You must understand. Love is not a weakness, Vladislav. It's the greatest strength we have. Your people don't need a cold, distant figurehead. They need a king who understands their struggles, who fights for them because he loves them. As they twirled across the floor, Ilinca could see the cracks forming in Vladislav's resolve. And what of our enemies? He asked. Those who would use any perceived weakness against us? Ilinca's eyes blazed with conviction. Then we face them together, united by love, for each other, for this kingdom, for your people. That's a force far more powerful than fear or intimidation. The music swelled to a crescendo, and Vladislav pulled Ilinca closer. Their bodies pressed together as they moved as one. The air between them crackled with electricity, every point of contact a burning reminder of what they were trying to deny. As the final notes faded away, they stood frozen, lost in each other's eyes. The ballroom around them had gone silent, the entire court holding its breath as they waited to see what would happen next. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Vladislav's hand moved from Ilinca's waist to cup her cheek. You magnificent, infuriating woman, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. How do you always manage to see right through me? Ilinca smiled, her heart soaring. Because I see you, Vladislav, the real you, the man behind the crown. For a moment the world hung in balance. Then with a soft curse, Vladislav pulled Ilinca to him and kissed her soundly, right there in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by the stunned nobility of the realm. Gasps and murmurs erupted around them, but neither Ilinca nor Vladislav paid them any mind. As they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Vladislav rested his forehead against hers. You were right, he said softly. About everything. I've been a fool. Ilinca laughed, tears of joy pricking at her eyes. Well, better late than never, Your Majesty. Vladislav straightened, keeping one arm firmly around Ilinca as he turned to face the assembled court. His voice rang out, clear and strong. My lords and ladies, honored guests, tonight marks a new beginning for our kingdom. Too long have I ruled with a heavy hand and a closed heart. But no more. With Lady Ilinca by my side, I pledge to you a new era of compassion, of justice, and of love for all our people. As cheers, some genuine, some hesitant, filled the ballroom, Ilinca looked up at Vladislav with wonder and pride. The road ahead would not be easy, she knew. There would be those who opposed this change, who saw love as a weakness to be exploited. But as Vladislav's arm tightened around her, his eyes shining with a mix of determination and newfound hope, Ilinca knew that together they could face anything. The winter of discontent that had gripped the kingdom for so long was finally beginning to thaw, and spring, with all its promise of new beginnings, was just around the corner. The weeks following the midwinter ball were a time of unprecedented change in the kingdom. Vladislav, true to his word, began implementing reforms that sent shockwaves through the court. Taxes were lowered for the common folk, granaries were opened to feed the hungry, and plans were set in motion to improve infrastructure in the outlying villages. Ilinca found herself busier than ever, working alongside Vladislav to draft new policies and mediate disputes between the king and his more conservative advisors. Through it all, their bond deepened, stolen moments of tenderness punctuating long days of hard work. But not everyone was pleased with the new direction of the kingdom. Whispers of discontent began to circulate among certain factions of the nobility, those who saw their own power and influence waning in the face of the king's reforms. It was on a crisp spring morning that Ilinca first caught wind of something more sinister brewing beneath the surface. She was making her way to the council chambers when she overheard a hushed conversation around a corner. "The king has gone soft," a voice hissed. "Bewitched by that common whore. If we don't act soon, everything we've worked for will be undone." Ilinca's blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear more. "Patience, my friend," another voice replied, smooth and cultured. "The pieces are already in motion. Soon, we'll be rid of both the lovesick fool and his peasant advisor." Footsteps approached, and Ilinca quickly ducked into an alcove, her heart pounding. As the conspirators passed, she caught a glimpse of their faces: Lord Gavril, one of Vladislav's oldest advisors, and Baron Radu, a powerful landowner from the eastern provinces. Once they were gone, Ilinca sagged against the wall, her mind racing. She had to warn Vladislav, but how? Would he believe her word against that of men he'd known for years? Lost in thought, she didn't notice the figure approaching until a hand clamped over her mouth. She struggled, but a familiar voice whispered in her ear, "Easy, my lady, it's me." Captain Dragos released her, his usually stoic face etched with concern. "I take it you overheard our esteemed nobles as well?" Ilinca nodded, relief washing over her. "We have to tell the king." Dragos shook his head. "Not here. The walls have ears. Meet me in the eastern tower at midnight. Bring his majesty if you can, but be discreet." With that, he melted back into the shadows, leaving Ilinca alone with her churning thoughts. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and forced normalcy. Ilinca went through the motions of her duties, all the while watching Vladislav interact with his court through new, wary eyes. Who else might be involved in this plot? How deep did the conspiracy run? As night fell, she made her way to Vladislav's private chambers, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. She knocked softly, entering when she heard his muffled, "Come in." Vladislav looked up from his desk, a smile breaking across his face at the sight of her. "Ilinca," he said warmly, rising to greet her. "To what do I owe the pleasure of a late-night visit?" But as he drew closer, his expression changed to one of concern. "What's wrong? You look pale." Ilinca took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Vladislav, I need you to listen to me very carefully. And I need you to trust me, even if what I'm about to say seems impossible." She recounted what she'd overheard, watching as Vladislav's face darkened with each word. When she finished, he turned away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Gavril," he said, his voice tight with disbelief and pain. "I've known him since I was a boy. He was my father's most trusted advisor. How could he?" Ilinca approached him cautiously, laying a hand on his arm. "I know it's hard to believe. But Vladislav, we don't have time for doubt. Captain Dragos wants to meet us in the eastern tower at midnight. He may have more information." Vladislav turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "You're certain of what you heard?" "I wish I wasn't," Ilinca replied softly. "But yes, I'm certain." He nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. "Then we go. But Ilinca, promise me you'll be careful, if anything were to happen to you." She silenced him with a gentle kiss. "We face this together, remember? Whatever comes, we'll meet it side by side." As the clock struck midnight, Ilinca and Vladislav made their way through the darkened corridors of the castle, every shadow seeming to hide potential danger. They reached the eastern tower without incident, finding Captain Dragos waiting for them, his face grim. "Your Majesty," he bowed. "My lady, I'm glad you came." "Speak plainly, Dragos," Vladislav commanded. "What do you know of this plot against us?" The captain's eyes darted around, checking for any sign of eavesdroppers. "It's worse than we feared, sire. The conspiracy runs deep. Lord Gavril and Baron Radu are but the tip of the iceberg. They've been recruiting disaffected nobles for months, playing on fears that your new policies will erode their power and wealth." Ilinca felt a chill run down her spine. "What are they planning?" Dragos's voice dropped to a whisper. "Assassination. They mean to strike during the upcoming harvest festival, when security will be stretched thin with so many visitors in the castle." Vladislav's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Do we know who else is involved?" "Not all," Dragos admitted, "but I have a list of suspected conspirators. The problem is, without hard evidence, moving against them could spark a civil war." Ilinca's mind raced. "Then we need to gather that evidence, set a trap perhaps." Vladislav nodded slowly. "It's risky, but it may be our only option. Dragos, can we trust your men?" "With my life, sire. I've handpicked a small team of loyal guards. They're ready to act on your command." As they began to hash out the details of their plan, a sudden noise from below made them all freeze, footsteps growing closer. "Quick!" Dragos hissed, ushering them towards a hidden panel in the wall. "In here." I'll try to divert them. Vladislav and Ilinca squeezed into the tight space, hardly daring to breathe as they listened to the approaching voices. I tell you, I saw them come this way, a voice insisted. Baron Radu. Ilinca realized with a start. And I tell you, you're jumping at shadows, came the irritated reply of Lord Gavril. The king is safely abed, and that meddlesome advisor of his is nowhere to be seen. My lords, Captain Dragos's voice cut in smoothly. Is something amiss? There was a moment of tense silence before Gavril spoke again. Not at all, Captain. We were just discussing some concerns about security for the upcoming festival. But it's late, and I'm sure you have your rounds to make. Of course, my lords. Rest well. The footsteps receded, and after what felt like an eternity, Dragos returned to release them from their hiding place. That was too close, Ilinca breathed, her heart still racing. Vladislav's face was set in grim determination. Indeed. But it also presents an opportunity. They suspect nothing, which means we have the element of surprise on our side. He turned to Dragos. Captain, I want you to double the guard rotations, but do it quietly. Make it look like we're relaxing security in preparation for the festival. Meanwhile, we'll set our trap. As they finalized their plans, Ilinca couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. They were playing a dangerous game, with the fate of the kingdom hanging in the balance. Just before they parted ways for the night, Vladislav pulled her close, his eyes intense in the dim light. Ilinca, if anything goes wrong. She silenced him with a finger to his lips. Don't. We're in this together, remember? Whatever comes, we face it side by side. He nodded, pressing a fierce kiss to her forehead. Together, he agreed. As they made their way back to their respective chambers, the weight of their task settled heavily upon them. The coming days would test their love, their resolve, and their very lives. But as Ilinca glanced at Vladislav, seeing the determination in his eyes, she felt a surge of hope. They had found each other against all odds. Surely, together, they could overcome this threat and build the future they'd dreamed of. A future of justice, compassion, and love for all their people. Little did they know, the true test of their bond was yet to come. The days leading up to the Harvest Festival were a whirlwind of tension and carefully orchestrated deception. Vladislav and Ilinca, along with Captain Dragos, worked tirelessly to set their trap while maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy. The castle buzzed with preparations for the upcoming celebration, but beneath the festive veneer, a deadly game of cat and mouse was unfolding. On the eve of the festival, Ilinca found herself pacing the length of her chambers, her mind racing with all the ways their plan could go wrong. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "Enter," she called, expecting to see one of her handmaidens. Instead, Vladislav slipped into the room, his face etched with worry. "Ilinca," he said softly, crossing to her in 3 long strides. "I needed to see you, to make sure you're all right." She melted into his embrace, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm fine," she murmured against his chest. "Just anxious about tomorrow." Vladislav pulled back slightly, cupping her face in his hands. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you have changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've given me hope, Ilinca. Hope for myself and for this kingdom." Tears pricked at Ilinca's eyes. "Vladislav, He silenced her with a gentle kiss. "Let me finish. If anything goes wrong, if it comes down to a choice between me and the safety of our people, I need you to promise me something." Ilinca's heart clenched, already knowing what he would ask. "Anything," she whispered. "Promise me you'll put the kingdom first, that you'll finish what we've started, no matter the cost." She wanted to argue, to tell him that she couldn't imagine a world without him in it. But the look in his eyes, equal parts love and grim determination, stopped her. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the king who would sacrifice everything for his people. "I promise," Ilinca said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "But you must promise me something in return. Promise me you'll fight with everything you have to come back to me. To us." Vladislav's smile was soft and sad. "With every breath in my body, My love, always. They spent the night in each other's arms, stealing what comfort they could in the face of the uncertain future that awaited them. The morning of the harvest festival dawned bright and clear, the autumn air crisp with promise. The castle grounds were soon filled with the sounds of laughter and music as villagers and nobles alike gathered to celebrate the bounty of the season. Ilinca stood on a balcony overlooking the main courtyard, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. She was dressed in a gown of deep crimson, a color chosen deliberately to make her stand out in the crowd, a tempting target for any would-be assassins. "Nervous?" a voice asked from behind her. She turned to see Captain Dragos, his usually stoic face betraying a hint of concern. "Terrified," Ilinca admitted, "but ready. Are your men in position?" Dragos nodded. "Scattered throughout the crowd, disguised as revelers. They'll move on my signal." A commotion at the far end of the courtyard drew their attention. King Vladislav had emerged from the castle, resplendent in his formal robes, a golden crown glinting atop his dark hair. The crowd cheered, many surging forward to catch a glimpse of their monarch. Ilinca's breath caught in her throat. Even from a distance she could see the tension in Vladislav's shoulders, the careful way his eyes scanned the faces around him. He was every inch the regal ruler, but she knew the toll this charade was taking on him. "It's time," Dragos said quietly. "Remember the plan. Stay visible, but be careful. We don't know exactly when or how they'll make their move." Ilinca nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. She made her way down to the courtyard, weaving through the crowd until she stood at Vladislav's side. His hand found hers, squeezing it briefly in silent communication. "My friends," Vladislav's voice boomed out across the gathering, "welcome to our annual harvest festival. Today we celebrate not just the bounty of our land, but the strength and unity of our people." As he spoke, Ilinca's eyes darted around the crowd, searching for familiar faces. There, Lord Gavril, his expression carefully neutral as he listened to the king's speech. And near the back, partially obscured by a group of merchants, Baron Radu, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. Vladislav continued, his words weaving a vision of a prosperous, just kingdom. But Ilinca could hear the underlying tension in his voice, the subtle way he was baiting their enemies. "Gone are the days of oppression and inequality," he declared. "No longer will the few profit at the expense of the many. Together we will build a realm where every citizen, from the highest noble to the humblest farmer, has a voice and a chance to thrive." A ripple of unease passed through certain members of the crowd. Ilinca saw Lord Gavril exchange a meaningful glance with Baron Radu. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion and sound. Baron Radu surged forward, his sword flashing in the sunlight as he charged towards the king. At the same instant, arrows whistled through the air from multiple directions. "Vladislav!" Ilinca cried out, moving to shield him with her body. But he was faster, pushing her down and out of harm's way as chaos erupted around them. Captain Dragos's voice cut through the pandemonium. "Now, protect the king!" Guards seemed to materialize out of nowhere, engaging the assassins in fierce combat, the air filled with the clash of steel and the screams of panicked onlookers. Ilinca scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she searched for Vladislav in the melee. She spotted him locked in combat with Baron Radu, their swords ringing out with each blow. Without thinking, she snatched a fallen guard's sword and threw herself into the fray. Years of secret training in her youth came flooding back as she parried a blow meant for Vladislav's exposed back. "Ilinca!" he gasped, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and pride. "Get to safety!" "Not a chance," she shot back, standing shoulder to shoulder with him as they faced their attackers. "Together, remember?" For a moment time seemed to stand still. Vladislav's eyes met hers, a world of emotion passing between them in that single glance. Then, with a shared nod of understanding, they turned as one to confront their enemies. The battle raged on, but it soon became clear that the conspirators were outnumbered and outmatched. One by one they were subdued and disarmed. Lord Gavril, seeing the tide turn against them, attempted to flee but was quickly cornered by Captain Dragos himself. As the last of the fighting died down, Ilinca found herself face to face with Baron Radu. The man's eyes burned with hatred as he lunged at her, his sword whistling through the air. She parried the blow, but the force of it sent her stumbling backward. Radu pressed his advantage, his blade coming dangerously close to her throat. "You've ruined everything," he snarled. "You and your peasant ideals. The kingdom will fall because of you." Ilinca's arms trembled with the effort of holding him off. "The kingdom will thrive," she gritted out, "because we choose love over fear, unity over division." With a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, Ilinca pushed back, throwing Radu off balance. In that split second of opportunity, she disarmed him with a move Vladislav had taught her during their secret training sessions. As Radu fell to his knees, defeated, Ilinca felt a presence at her back. Vladislav's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of support and pride. "It's over," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard. "The traitors have been revealed and will face justice for their crimes against the crown and the people." A cheer went up from the crowd, relief and joy mingling in the air. But Ilinca couldn't shake the weight of what had just transpired. They had won, yes, but at what cost? How many had been hurt or killed in this senseless grab for power? As if sensing her thoughts, Vladislav pulled her close, his arms encircling her protectively. "We did it," he murmured for her ears alone. "Together, just as we promised." Ilinca looked up into his face, seeing the mix of emotions there, relief, exhaustion, and an overwhelming love that took her breath away. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Vladislav's gaze swept over the courtyard, taking in the scene of victory and aftermath. "Now," he said, his voice filled with determination, "we rebuild. We show our people that love and justice truly can conquer fear and greed." As the sun began to set on that tumultuous day, Ilinca stood by Vladislav's side, facing their future together. The road ahead would not be easy. There were wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and a kingdom to transform. But as she felt the warmth of Vladislav's hand in hers, Ilinca knew that they could face anything, as long as they did it side by side. The harvest festival had become a battle, but from its ashes a new era for the kingdom would rise, one built on the unshakable foundation of a love that had defied all odds. The days following the thwarted assassination attempt were a whirlwind of activity within Castlebrunn. The dungeons were filled with conspirators awaiting trial, while Vladislav and Ilinca worked tirelessly to restore order and calm the fears of both nobles and commoners alike. On a crisp autumn morning, Ilinca stood before the ornate mirror in her chambers, adjusting the formal robe she wore as the king's advisor. Today was the day of the public trial for Lord Gavril and Baron Radu, the ringleaders of the failed coup. The outcome of this trial would set the tone for Vladislav's reign going forward, and the weight of that responsibility sat heavily on both their shoulders. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. "Enter," she called, expecting to see one of her handmaidens. Instead, Vladislav stepped into the room, his face a mask of concern. "Ilinca," he said softly, crossing to her in a few long strides. "Are you ready for this?" She turned to face him, taking in the worry lines etched around his eyes. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, reaching up to smooth a non-existent wrinkle from his formal attire. "Are you?" Vladislav caught her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "I must be. The future of our kingdom hangs in the balance today." Ilinca nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "What troubles you most?" she asked, sensing there was more to his concern than just the trial. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a rare display of uncertainty. "I fear the consequences of being too lenient, or too harsh. If we show weakness now, it could embolden others who might seek to overthrow us. But if we're too severe in our punishment, we risk becoming the very tyrants they accused us of being," Ilinca finished for him. "Exactly." Vladislav's eyes met hers, searching for answers. "What would you have me do, Ilinca? You've always been my conscience, my guide in matters of the heart. I need your wisdom now more than ever." Ilinca took a moment to gather her thoughts, weighing her words carefully. "I believe," she said slowly, "that this is an opportunity to show both strength and mercy, to demonstrate that your rule is one of justice, tempered with compassion." Vladislav's brow furrowed. "How do you propose we achieve that balance?" Let the punishment fit the crime, Ilinca suggested. Those who actively took up arms against you, Baron Radu and his fellow combatants, they committed treason in its purest form. The law is clear on the consequences of such actions. Vladislav nodded grimly. Execution. Yes, Ilinca agreed, her voice heavy with the weight of the decision. But for those like Lord Gavril, who conspired but did not directly participate in the violence, perhaps there's room for a different approach. Go on, Vladislav urged, his interest piqued. Strip them of their titles and lands, Ilinca proposed. Exile them to the farthest reaches of the kingdom, where they can live out their days as common laborers. Let them experience firsthand the lives of those they sought to oppress. A slow smile spread across Vladislav's face. Brilliant, he murmured. It sends a clear message while still offering a path to redemption, however difficult that path may be. Ilinca felt a wave of relief wash over her. You approve then? More than approve, Vladislav said, pulling her into a warm embrace. Once again you've shown me the way forward when I could see only darkness. What would I do without you, my love? Ilinca leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his solid presence. Let's hope you never have to find out, she murmured. As they made their way to the great hall where the trial would be held, Ilinca couldn't help but feel a mixture of anticipation and dread. The corridors were lined with guards, their faces grim and alert. The atmosphere in the castle was tense, everyone acutely aware of how close they had come to disaster. The great hall was packed to capacity, nobles and commoners alike jostling for position to witness this historic moment. As Vladislav and Ilinca entered, a hush fell over the crowd. They made their way to the dais at the front of the room, where two ornate chairs had been placed, one for the king and one for his trusted advisor. Ilinca felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as she took her seat beside Vladislav. She knew there were still those who resented her presence, who saw her as an upstart commoner who had bewitched their king. But she held her head high, determined to prove her worth through her actions. Captain Drago stepped forward, his voice ringing out across the hall. Bring forth the accused. The crowd parted as guards led in Lord Gavril and Baron Radu, both men shackled and looking considerably worse for wear after their time in the dungeons. Ilinca's heart clenched at the sight of Lord Gavril, a man she had come to know and even respect during her time at court. How had it come to this? Vladislav's voice, strong and clear, cut through her musings. Lord Gavril, Baron Radu, you stand accused of high treason against the crown. How do you plead? Baron Radu, his face twisted with defiance, spat on the ground. I plead only that I failed to rid this kingdom of a weak king and his peasant whore. A gasp rippled through the crowd at his audacity. Ilinca felt Vladislav tense beside her, but his voice remained steady as he turned to Lord Gavril. And you, my old friend? What say you to these charges? Lord Gavril seemed to age a decade before their eyes, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his actions. I plead guilty, Your Majesty. I allowed fear and greed to cloud my judgment, to forget the oath of loyalty I swore so many years ago. Murmurs filled the hall as Vladislav considered their words. Ilinca watched him closely, seeing the conflict play out across his face. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Baron Radu, your actions and words leave me no choice. You have committed treason of the highest order, taking up arms against your rightful king and endangering the lives of innocent citizens. The penalty for such a crime is death. You will be executed at dawn tomorrow. The Baron's face contorted with rage, but before he could speak, Vladislav continued. As for you, Lord Gavril, and those who conspired but did not actively participate in the violence, I am faced with a difficult decision. Your actions warrant the severest punishment under our laws. However, he paused, his eyes meeting Ilinca's for a brief moment. I believe there is value in offering a path to redemption, no matter how difficult that path may be. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Ilinca held her breath, waiting to see how Vladislav would implement their plan. Therefore, you and your co-conspirators will be stripped of your titles and lands. You will be exiled to the farthest reaches of our kingdom, where you will live out your days as common laborers. Perhaps in time, you will come to understand the true meaning of loyalty and service to one's people. The hall erupted into a cacophony of voices, some expressing approval, others outrage at what they saw as leniency. Vladislav raised his hand, calling for silence. "Let it be known," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with authority, "that from this day forward, our kingdom shall be governed not by fear and oppression, but by justice tempered with compassion. We will build a realm where every citizen, regardless of their birth or station, has the opportunity to thrive and contribute to the greater good." As the gravity of Vladislav's words sank in, Ilinca felt a swell of pride and love for the man beside her. He had found the perfect balance between strength and mercy, setting a new course for their kingdom's future. The trial concluded, and as the accused were led away, Ilinca turned to Vladislav. "You did well," she said softly. "Your words will be remembered for generations to come." Vladislav took her hand, bringing it to his lips for a gentle kiss. "Our words, my love. This new era we're building, it's as much your vision as mine." As they stood to address the assembled crowd once more, Ilinca felt a sense of hope blossoming in her chest. The road ahead would not be easy, but together, she and Vladislav would forge a future brighter than any their kingdom had known before. Little did they know, the greatest challenge to their love and their reign was yet to come, a test that would push them to the very limits of their strength and devotion. As the crisp autumn air gave way to the first biting winds of winter, Castle Bran hummed with a newfound energy. The failed coup and its aftermath had sparked a period of intense change throughout the kingdom. Vladislav and Ilinca worked tirelessly to implement reforms, their days filled with council meetings, public audiences, and long nights poring over reports and proposals. On a particularly frosty morning, Ilinca stood at the window of the royal study, watching snowflakes dance on the wind. She felt Vladislav's presence before she heard him, a warmth at her back that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. "You're up early," he murmured, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Ilinca leaned into his embrace, savoring the moment of peace. "I couldn't sleep. There's so much still to be done." Vladislav pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "We've accomplished more in these past months than I dared hope. The people are beginning to trust in our vision for the future. But at what cost?" Ilinca turned in his arms, her eyes searching his face. "The nobles grow restless, Vladislav. They see their power slipping away with each new decree." A shadow passed over the king's features. "Let them be restless. We cannot build a just kingdom on the backs of the oppressed." Ilinca nodded but couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been growing in her heart. "I fear we may be moving too quickly. Change is necessary, yes, but if we push too hard, too fast, we risk another uprising." Vladislav finished for her, his jaw tightening. "I know, but what would you have me do, Ilinca? Return to the old ways? Allow the wealthy few to gorge themselves while the rest of our people starve?" "Of course not," Ilinca said softly, reaching up to cup his cheek. "But perhaps there's a middle ground, a way to bring the nobles into our vision, rather than alienating them entirely." Vladislav leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. When he opened them again, there was a spark of curiosity there. "What did you have in mind?" Before Ilinca could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Captain Dragos entered, his face grim. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, my lady," he said, bowing slightly, "but we've received troubling news from the northern provinces." Vladislav straightened, instantly alert. "Speak plainly, Captain. What's happened?" Dragos hesitated, his eyes darting between the king and Ilinca. "There are reports of unrest, sire. It seems a group of displaced nobles have been rallying support among the local population. They speak of restoring the old order." Ilinca felt her blood run cold. This was precisely what she had feared, the consequences of pushing too hard, too fast. Vladislav's voice was tight with barely contained anger. "Who leads them?" "We're not certain, Your Majesty," Dragos replied, "but there are whispers that Lord Gavril's son Alexandru may be involved." Ilinca's heart sank. Alexandru had been absent from court since his father's exile. But she had hoped the young man would see reason, would understand the necessity of the changes they were implementing. Vladislav began to pace, his agitation palpable. We cannot allow this insurrection to take root. If we show weakness now, everything we've worked for will crumble. What do you propose? Ilinca asked, already dreading the answer. The king's eyes met hers, and she saw a flash of the old Vladislav there, the man who had ruled with an iron fist before she had softened his heart. We must make an example of them, crush this rebellion before it can truly begin. Ilinca felt a chill run down her spine. Vladislav, please, think carefully before you act. These are our people, misguided though they may be. If we respond with force, we risk losing the trust we've worked so hard to build. Vladislav's expression softened slightly at her words. He reached out, taking her hands in his. What would you suggest, my love? You've always been the voice of reason in my ear. I need that wisdom now more than ever. Ilinca took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. Send me, she said finally. Let me go to the northern provinces as your emissary. I'll speak with Alexandru, try to understand their grievances. Perhaps we can find a peaceful solution. Absolutely not, Vladislav said immediately, his grip on her hands tightening. It's too dangerous. If anything were to happen to you, it's our best chance, Ilinca insisted. They know me, Vladislav. They've seen how I've influenced you, how I've advocated for change. If anyone can reach them, make them see reason, it's me. Captain Dragos cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. If I may, Your Majesty, Lady Ilinca's plan has merit. A show of force could ignite a full-scale rebellion, but a diplomatic approach might diffuse the situation before it comes to that. Vladislav looked between them, conflict clear on his face. Finally he nodded, though the motion seemed to pain him. Very well, but you'll not go alone. Captain, assemble a small team of your most trusted men to accompany her, and Ilinca. He turned back to her, his eyes intense. You must promise me you'll be careful. At the first sign of danger, you return. Swear it. Ilinca raised their joined hands to her lips, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. I swear it, my love. I'll come back to you. Always. The next few days were a flurry of preparation. As Ilinca packed for her journey, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something monumental. The fate of the kingdom, the future they had dreamed of building together, it all hung in the balance. On the morning of her departure, Vladislav met her in the castle courtyard. The air was thick with tension, unspoken fears hanging between them like a physical presence. Are you certain about this? He asked one last time, his hand cupping her cheek. There's still time to change your mind. I could send Dragos in your stead. Ilinca leaned into his touch, memorizing the feel of his skin against hers. It has to be me, Vladislav. You know that as well as I do. He nodded, resignation and pride warring in his eyes. You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Ilinca Petrescu, and the wisest. Our people are lucky to have you fighting for them. For us, she corrected gently. Everything I do for the future we're building together. Vladislav pulled her close, crushing her to his chest in a fierce embrace. Come back to me, he whispered fiercely. Whatever happens, whatever you find there, come back to me. Ilinca clung to him, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability before she had to don the mantle of royal emissary. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, she promised. As she mounted her horse, preparing to ride out with her small escort, Ilinca took one last look at Vladislav. He stood tall and proud, every inch the king, but she could see the worry etched in the lines of his face. I love you, she called out, her voice carrying across the courtyard. Never forget that. Vladislav's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. And I love you, my fierce rebel. Now go, change the world. I'll be waiting. With a final nod, Ilinca urged her horse forward, leading her party out of the castle gates and onto the snow-covered road north. As Castle Bran faded into the distance behind her, she squared her shoulders, steeling herself for the challenges ahead. Little did she know, the true test of her love, her loyalty, and everything she believed in was waiting for her in the frozen landscapes of the north. The fate of a kingdom hung in the balance, and Ilinca Petrescu was riding straight into the heart of the storm. The journey north was arduous, with bitter winds and treacherous ice-covered roads slowing their progress. Ilinca and her small retinue pushed on, determination fueling them through the long, cold days. As they approached the town of North Haven, the epicenter of the unrest, tension hung in the air like a heavy fog. Captain Mihai, the leader of her guard detail, rode up beside Ilinca as they crested a hill overlooking the town. "My lady," he said, his voice low with concern, "perhaps we should make camp here for the night. Approach in the morning when we're rested and can better assess the situation." Ilinca shook her head, her eyes fixed on the smoke rising from North Haven's chimneys. "No, Captain. We've come too far to delay now. They're expecting us, and I won't give them cause to doubt our sincerity." As they rode into town, Ilinca was struck by the eerie quiet. Faces peered out from behind curtains, quickly disappearing when they realized they'd been spotted. The few people on the streets hurried about their business, avoiding eye contact. They were met at the town square by a small delegation, led by a man Ilinca recognized immediately, Alexandru Gavril, son of the exiled lord. His face was a mask of cool politeness, but she could see the anger simmering in his eyes. "Lady Ilinca," he said, bowing stiffly, "welcome to North Haven. We're honored by your presence." Ilinca dismounted, approaching Alexandru with an outstretched hand. "Thank you for receiving us, Lord Alexandru. I hope we can speak openly and find a path forward that benefits all our people." Alexandru's grip was firm as he shook her hand, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Please follow me. We've prepared accommodations for you and your men." As they walked through the town, Ilinca couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The atmosphere was tense, like a bowstring pulled too tight and ready to snap at any moment. They were led to a large manor house, clearly the seat of local power. Inside, a fire roared in the great hall, chasing away the chill of the winter day. Alexandru gestured for Ilinca to take a seat near the hearth. "I must admit," he said as servants brought the mulled wine, "I was surprised when we received word of your coming. We had expected a more forceful response from the crown." Ilinca sipped her wine, choosing her words carefully. "King Vladislav and I believe in the power of dialogue, Lord Alexandru. We're here to listen, to understand your concerns, and to find a solution that works for everyone." Alexandru's laugh was bitter. "Concerns? Is that what you call them? My father, a loyal servant of the crown for decades, stripped of his titles and sent into exile. Families who have governed these lands for generations, suddenly told their ancestral rights mean nothing. And for what? So your precious common folk can play at being nobles?" Ilinca felt a flash of anger at his words but forced herself to remain calm. "Change is never easy, Alexandru, but surely you can see that the old system was unsustainable. People were suffering, starving, while a select few lived in luxury." "And now?" Alexandru challenged. "You think your reforms have made everything better? I've ridden through these lands, Lady Ilinca. I've seen the confusion, the chaos your policies have created. The common folk don't know how to manage the responsibilities you've thrust upon them. They're floundering, and it's the entire kingdom that will pay the price." Ilinca leaned forward, her voice intense. "Then help us, Alexandru. Work with us to implement these changes in a way that benefits everyone. Your experience, your knowledge of these lands, it could be invaluable in ensuring a smooth transition." For a moment she thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty in Alexandru's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a hard resolve. "It's too late for that, my lady. The time for talk has passed. Now we must act to save our kingdom from those who would destroy it, even if they do so with the best of intentions." Before Ilinca could respond, the doors to the great hall burst open. Captain Mihai rushed in, his face pale. "My lady, we must leave immediately. There's an army approaching from the east, flying the banners of the old nobility." Ilinca's heart raced as she turned back to Alexandru, who was now standing, a grim smile on his face. "Did you really think we'd just sit idly by while you dismantled everything we've built over generations? I'm sorry, Lady Ilinca, but you've walked right into our trap." "Alexandru, please," Ilinca pleaded, rising to her feet. "Think about what you're doing. This path leads only to bloodshed and suffering for all our people. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw doubt cross Alexandru's face, but then his expression hardened once more. "Guards," he called out. "Escort Lady Ilinca and her men to their quarters. They are not to leave until I give the word." As Ilinca was led away, her mind raced. She had to find a way to stop this, to reach Alexandru and make him see reason. But more than that, she had to warn Vladislav. The kingdom was on the brink of civil war, and she was powerless to prevent it. In her assigned chamber, Ilinca paced like a caged animal. She could hear the commotion outside as the rebel army entered the town. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Enter," she called, tensing for a confrontation. To her surprise, it was a young maid who slipped into the room, her eyes darting nervously about. "My lady," she whispered, "I'm here to help. My name is Elena, and I don't agree with what Lord Alexandru is doing." Ilinca's heart leapt with hope. "Elena, thank you. Can you get a message to my men, or better yet, to Castle Bran?" Elena shook her head. "The town is locked down tight, my lady, but I might be able to help you escape. There's a secret passage used in the old days for smuggling. It leads out beyond the town walls." Ilinca's mind raced, weighing her options. If she escaped, she might be able to warn Vladislav, to prevent the bloodshed that was sure to come. But leaving meant abandoning her men and losing any chance of reaching Alexandru through diplomacy. "My lady?" Elena prompted, her voice trembling with fear and urgency. "We must decide quickly. The rebel leaders are meeting now to plan their march on Castle Bran." Ilinca closed her eyes, her heart torn. The face of Vladislav flashed in her mind, his love, his trust in her. She had promised to come back to him, but she had also sworn to do whatever it took to protect their people, to build the future they had dreamed of together. Opening her eyes, Ilinca met Elena's gaze with resolve. "Show me this passage," she said. "But first I need paper and ink. There's a message I must leave behind." As Elena hurried to fetch the writing materials, Ilinca steeled herself for what was to come. She would escape, yes, but not to flee to safety. Instead, she would race ahead of the rebel army, rallying support from the common folk along the way. It was a desperate plan, fraught with danger, but it was the only way she could see to prevent the war that threatened to tear their kingdom apart. With trembling hands, she began to write. "My dearest Vladislav, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Not because I have abandoned our cause or our love, but because I must do whatever it takes to save our people from the storm that is coming. Alexandru and the old nobility march on Castle Bran. They have an army, fueled by fear and resentment of the changes we've brought. But I believe in the goodness of our people, in their desire for a just and equitable kingdom. I ride now to rally support, to show the common folk that their voices matter, that the future we're building is worth fighting for. It's a desperate gamble, my love, but one I must take. Please, trust in me as I trust in you. Prepare our defenses, but do not strike first. Give me time to turn the tide, to show our people a better way forward. I carry your love with me always, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Wait for me, my king. I will return to you, come what may. All my love, Ilinca." As she folded the letter and sealed it with her ring, Ilinca felt a strange calm settle over her. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But she knew deep in her soul that this was the right choice. For herself, for Vladislav, and for the kingdom they both loved so dearly. Elena returned, her face pale but determined. "The passage is ready, my lady. We must go now, while the guards are distracted by the army's arrival." Ilinca nodded, tucking the letter securely into her bodice. As she followed Elena through the shadowy corridors of the manor, her mind was already racing ahead, planning her next moves. The future of the kingdom hung in the balance, and Ilinca Petrescu was prepared to risk everything to secure it. With a silent prayer for strength and guidance, she stepped into the secret passage, leaving behind the safety of these walls and venturing into the unknown. Little did she know, the true test of her love, her conviction, and her very soul was only just beginning. The bitter winter wind whipped around Ilinca as she urged her horse forward through the snow-covered landscape. For days, she had ridden tirelessly, stopping in every village and town along the way to rally support for the crown. Her impassioned speeches, delivered in town squares and humble taverns alike, had begun to turn the tide of public opinion. As she approached the outskirts of Ironhold, the last major settlement before Castle Bran, Ilinca's heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and fear. This was where the fate of the kingdom would be decided. The rebel army, led by Alexandru, was not far behind her, and Vladislav's forces would be approaching from the other direction. Riding into the town center, Ilinca was heartened to see a large crowd already gathered. Word of her journey had spread, and the people of Ironhold were eager to hear what she had to say. As she dismounted, a familiar voice called out to her, "Lady Ilinca, thank the heavens you're here." She turned to see Captain Mihai pushing through the crowd, his face etched with relief and concern. "Captain, how did you escape Northaven?" Mihai bowed slightly. "Your letter to His Majesty inspired us, my lady. We managed to overpower our guards and ride out ahead of the rebel army. We've been spreading word of your mission, gathering supporters along the way." Ilinca felt a surge of hope at his words. "And Vladislav? Have you had any news from the castle?" The captain's expression grew grave. "His Majesty's forces are a day's ride from here. But, my lady, the rebel army is closer. They'll reach Ironhold by nightfall." Ilinca's mind raced. They were out of time. Whatever was to happen, it would happen here, in this town caught between two armies. She squared her shoulders, turning to address the gathered crowd. "People of Ironhold," she began, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "I come to you not just as an emissary of the crown, but as a fellow citizen of this great kingdom. For too long, we have been divided, nobles and commoners, rich and poor. But today we stand on the brink of a new era." The crowd listened intently as Ilinca spoke of Vladislav's vision for a more just and equitable realm. She told them of the reforms already underway, of the opportunities now open to those who had long been denied a voice. "But there are those who would drag us back into the shadows of the past," she continued, her voice passionate. "Those who believe that power should belong only to a select few, while the rest of us toil in obscurity. They march on us now, an army fueled by fear and greed." A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. Ilinca pressed on, her eyes blazing with conviction. "I ask you now to make a choice. Will you stand with us for a future where every citizen has a chance to thrive? Or will you allow the old guard to strip away the progress we've made, to return us to a time of oppression and inequality?" For a moment, silence reigned. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "But how do we know the king's promises aren't just empty words? How can we trust that things will really change?" Ilinca's heart clenched, recognizing the speaker as Alexandru stepped forward. He must have ridden ahead of his army, perhaps hoping to sway the people of Ironhold to his cause. "A fair question," Ilinca acknowledged, meeting Alexandru's gaze steadily. "And one I've asked myself many times on this journey. But I've seen the change with my own eyes. In every village and town I've passed through, I've met people whose lives have been transformed by the king's reforms." She turned back to the crowd, her voice ringing with sincerity. "I've seen children who now have access to education, regardless of their birth. I've met farmers who no longer struggle under the weight of crushing taxes. And I've witnessed communities coming together, taking charge of their own destinies in ways they never could before." Alexandru scoffed, stepping closer. "Pretty words, Lady Ilinca, but words don't feed hungry mouths or protect our borders. The old ways may not have been perfect, but they kept our kingdom strong and stable for generations." Ilinca felt a surge of compassion for Alexandru despite everything. She could see the fear and uncertainty behind his bravado. "Change is never easy, Alexandru," she said softly, "but clinging to the past out of fear will only lead us to ruin. The world is changing around us. We must adapt or be left behind." She turned back to the crowd, her voice rising with passion. "I'm not asking you to blindly trust in promises. I'm asking you to believe in yourselves, in your power to shape the future of this kingdom. King Vladislav's reforms aren't about taking power away from the nobility. They're about giving power to all of us, to work together for the good of everyone. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Ilinca could see people nodding, their expressions thoughtful. But Alexandru wasn't done yet. "And what of tradition?" he demanded. "What of the sacred oaths that have bound noble houses to the crown for centuries? Would you have us throw all of that away?" Ilinca shook her head. "Not throw away, Alexandru. Evolve. Those oaths were meant to protect and serve the people. We're simply expanding the definition of who the people are. The nobility still has a crucial role to play, as leaders, as mentors, as stewards of our shared heritage. But that role must change with the times." She took a step towards him, her voice softening. "I know you love this kingdom, Alexandru. I know you want what's best for our people. But war is not the answer. Join us. Help us build this new future. Your experience, your knowledge. We need it. We need you." For a long moment, Alexandru stood frozen, conflict clear on his face. The crowd held its breath, sensing the weight of this moment. Then, slowly, Alexandru's shoulders sagged. I don't know if I can believe in this vision of yours," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I know I can't be the one to plunge our kingdom into civil war. Not when there's even a chance that you might be right." A cheer went up from the crowd. Ilinca felt tears prick at her eyes as she clasped Alexandru's hand. "Thank you," she said fervently. "This is the first step towards healing the rifts that have divided us for too long." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the town. Ilinca's heart leapt as she saw the royal banner approaching. Vladislav had arrived. The king dismounted in one fluid motion, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Ilinca. In 3 long strides he was before her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "My love," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "When I received your letter, I feared. But you've done it. You've saved us all." Ilinca leaned back, cupping Vladislav's face in her hands. "We did it together," she corrected gently. "All of us. This is only the beginning." Vladislav nodded, then turned to face the assembled crowd. His voice rang out, clear and strong. "People of Ironhold, of all our great kingdom, today marks a new chapter in our history. No longer will we be divided by ancient grudges or outdated traditions. From this day forward, we move into the future as one people, united in our desire for justice, prosperity, and peace." A great cheer went up from the crowd. As Ilinca looked out over the sea of faces, commoners and nobles alike, all joining together in celebration, she felt a profound sense of hope. The road ahead would not be easy, but they had taken the first crucial steps towards a brighter future. Later that night, as Ilinca and Vladislav stood on the balcony of the town's keep, looking out over the peaceful streets below, the king turned to her with a tender smile. "You know," he said softly, "when I first met you, I thought you would be the end of everything I had built. But now I see that you were always meant to be my beginning." Ilinca leaned into him, her heart full to bursting. "And you, my love, were always meant to be the king who would lead us into a new era. Together, there's nothing we cannot accomplish." As they sealed their words with a kiss, the stars twinkled overhead, bearing witness to the triumph of love over fear, of hope over despair. The kingdom had been transformed, not just by grand gestures and sweeping reforms, but by the power of 2 hearts beating as one, dedicated to a shared vision of a better world for all. And so, dear listeners, our tale comes to an end. But for Vladislav and Ilinca, for the people of their realm, it was only the beginning of a grand new adventure. An adventure of building bridges instead of walls, of fostering understanding instead of resentment, of proving that love, in all its forms, truly can change the world. May we all find the courage to follow in their footsteps, to reach across the divides that separate us, and to build a future as bright and beautiful as the love that conquered a kingdom.